How's it going, everybody? Welcome to another edition of The Opinion. And let's talk about it. Gregg Popovich and the San Antonio Spurs. The San Antonio Spurs, at the time of making this video, on a 17-game losing streak, which is now a franchise record. This is coming off the heels of having the #1 pick in drafting Victor Wembanyama in last year's draft. The Spurs have gotten off to, I believe, a 3-19 start in a 17-game losing streak, which is only second to the Detroit Pistons, who have now lost 20 games in a row themselves. So the Spurs are the worst team in the West, one of the bottom 3 teams in the entire NBA. And I'm going to come out and say it. I think that Gregg Popovich, at this point in his career, Gregg Popovich should step down. He's 74 years old. Not saying that a 74-year-old can't coach, but when you look at Gregg Popovich being 74 years old and the players on his team, many of them being less than 25 years of age, Gregg Popovich is more than 50 years old, more than 50 years older than a lot of his players. He doesn't really have a lot in common with them. I mean, he can teach them about life and different things like that, but at some point in time, the game passes everybody by, whether it be players, whether it be coaches. The best and the best of the best of them have had the game pass them by. And I think that that's what's happened with Gregg Popovich. And I'm going to lay out in this video some evidence to support why I think Gregg Popovich should at least step down from coaching and at least just maybe retain the position of team president of basketball operations. Because at this stage in his career, I don't think Popovich can really get the most out of his players like he used to when he had Duncan, Parker, Ginobili, Dave Robinson, Sean Elliott, Avery Johnson, and the list goes on. This is a new crop of players. The NBA is played differently today, and I just don't feel like Popovich is getting the most out of his team, because the first example of that is that last year's team had the same players. You had Keldon Johnson, you had Jeremy Sohan, you had Devin Vassell, you had I'm forgetting his name, Trey Jones, and then you had the power forward and center, Zach Collins, but you didn't have Wembanyama, and you were better last year when you were actually trying to tank. That's what's crazy. The Spurs were a better team last year when they were pulling guys out of the lineup, sitting guys here and there, trying to tank, calling guys up from their G League team, intentionally trying to tank. And they're not doing that this year, and they bring back the same players who I think are actually pretty decent players. Keldon Johnson, Devin Vassell, I think those guys are pretty decent players. Maybe not long-term players to pair with Victor Wembanyama, but pretty decent players. And then you add a player like Victor Wembanyama, which we can definitely see his talent, and you're worse. You're not tanking. So I don't want to hear guys in the comments say that they're tanking because the Spurs are playing all of their guys. Like Wembanyama's played every game except for one. So they're playing all of their guys every game, and they're giving their guys the majority of the minutes, the better players, and they just can't win a game. And I think that it comes down to coaching, because the Spurs don't have the best roster, and I did not predict that the Spurs would make the playoffs this year. But man, who predicted that the Spurs would be 3-19 on a 17-game losing streak and counting? Because as I look at the rest of their December schedule, I don't see the Spurs winning another game in the month of December. I could be wrong, but I just don't see it. Now let's dig into Popovich a little bit more and why Gregg Popovich should step down. I don't think the fire is there anymore. Does everybody remember when Gregg Popovich, at the beginning of a game, whenever his team would make a mistake, whether that be letting somebody get an offensive rebound, a defensive rotation, maybe a mishap offensively, and Gregg Popovich would immediately call timeout to get things straight? He doesn't do that. And this would be the perfect team to do that with, because this is a very young team. He would do that with his veteran teams who knew better, and Popovich would still call timeout. He doesn't do that anymore. Another thing you don't see Popovich doing, he doesn't get technical fouls anymore. Now, I know what you're wondering, what do technical fouls have to do with the game? But to me, technical fouls shows that you're passionate about winning. You're passionate. You're so passionate that you're willing to get a technical foul and go against what the referee saw out there. So you don't see Popovich getting technical fouls anymore. What about player development? The last really good player that Popovich developed was DeJounte Murray. Devin Vassell and Keldon Johnson, I feel like those guys are the same players they were when they first came in the league. Jeremy Sohan, same player he was when he first came in the league, although he's only been there for a couple of years. Where are the Corey Josephs? Where are the Gary Neals, the Danny Greens, the Kawhi Leonards? Where are those types of players in terms of development? I'm not trying to say that I'm not trying to say the Spurs should have a Kawhi Leonard caliber player on this team, but I'm saying that in terms of development, you're not seeing Coach Popovich and the Spurs develop the players like they used to. Like I said, when they had Corey Joseph, Kawhi Leonard, DeJounte Murray, Gary Neal, and the list goes on and on as well. Another reason why I don't believe that Popovich can get the most out of his players in today's game, look at a player like DeMar DeRozan. DeMar DeRozan averaged, when he played with the Spurs, about 20, 21 points per game. The first year that he takes off and goes to the Chicago Bulls, who have other scorers, by the way, like Zach LaVine and others, he goes from averaging 21 points a game to averaging 27 per game. And then he averaged 24 a game for the Bulls last year. Now his average is down a little bit this year, but that's only because he's now becoming an older player. He's in his mid 30s, so you can't expect him to average 27 constantly. But DeMar DeRozan, how do you go from averaging 21 to averaging 27? So you're telling me Pop was Pop doing something to hinder DeMar DeRozan's offense? I don't know. You go from someone like DeJounte Murray, who shoots a better percentage, I believe, from three-point land, and he averages the same amount with an actual number one in Trae Young. So how does DeJounte Murray leave, goes to a team that has a guy that scores more than he does and averages the same as he did when he was with the San Antonio Spurs? Need I point out a couple of years ago when the Spurs actually had DeMar DeRozan, DeJounte Murray, Derek White, Keldon Johnson, Devin Vassell, Jakob Poeltl, and Rudy Gay, and LaMarcus Aldridge, and all those guys, and they still couldn't make the playoffs. Now you're telling me that team with those veterans and the talent that you had, I'm not saying that they should have been the number one seed. Please, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that with that type of talent and experience, that team should have at least been able to make a 6th, 7th, maybe even an 8th seed. Those teams who at best were winning 32, 33, and 34 games. Now, we're not talking about the first year that DeMar DeRozan came, because they did make the playoffs. But we're talking about the year after that, the pandemic year, and then the year after the pandemic year. And those guys were missing the playoffs with those types of players. Now you look at Derek White, he fits in very good with the Boston Celtics, plays a really good role with them. In some ways, he looks better with them than he did when he was with the Spurs. Now, how does that happen? The only common denominator here is Gregg Popovich. He's holding the players down. The lineups don't make sense. He's not drawing up plays for Wembanyama. He doesn't draw up plays for Devin Vassell, who's their best knockdown shooter. They don't run pin downs. I've just given you all the evidence as to why Gregg Popovich needs to step down. This is not the first time that we've seen him not get the most out of his team. He couldn't get it when DeMar DeRozan was on the team, when you had DeJounte Murray and DeMar DeRozan and Keldon Johnson and Derek White and LaMarcus Aldridge and Rudy Gay and Patty Mills. And he still couldn't get those teams to make the playoffs. Now, a lot of people are going to say, well, there's not a lot of talent on this team. Well, go back to 2017, 2018. The last year Kawhi was with the Spurs. Kawhi only played 9 games that year. So you basically had LaMarcus Aldridge and a bunch of guys that were just spot-up shooters. And the Spurs made the 7th seed. I feel like that was one of Gregg Popovich's best jobs coaching. Because who would have thought that the Spurs would have been able to make a 7 seed with just LaMarcus Aldridge and a bunch of spot-up shooters? Now, they did have Tony Parker and Ginobili, but those guys were old at that point in time. Those guys did not contribute nearly as much to that team as the Patty Mills and DeJounte Murray and the Derek White and your other role players as well. So look at what Popovich did with that team, and then now look at what he's doing with this team. If someone has to explain to me why the Spurs are worse this year than they were last year minus Wembanyama. So you actually have a better talent. Everyone can see Wembanyama's talent, and you're worse. Now, once again, no, I was not predicting the Spurs to make the playoffs, but I at least thought the Spurs could win 30, 35 games. At this pace, they're not even going to win 15 games. So, yes, I think Popovich needs to step down, just retain his spot as retain his role as president of basketball operations, and let's get some new blood into the San Antonio Spurs to coach the San Antonio Spurs, because I believe somebody else at this stage in the game could get more out of this San Antonio Spurs roster than what Popovich is getting right now. And then another thing, Wembanyama's a young player. Popovich isn't going to coach him his whole career, so they need to start making that transition to a new coach right now rather than later as well. So leave your comments below. What do you think? What do you think Gregg Popovich should do? Should he stick around and develop the young talent, or do you think Gregg Popovich, or do you agree with me, Gregg Popovich should step down? Leave your comments below. Like this video, because I want this video to get around. I want this video to get around to as many people as possible. So hit the like button so this video can circulate to as many people in the NBA, as many minds, as many Spurs fans. I want to see what your thoughts are, but leave your comments below. And other than that, I'm out.